Let's be short, concise, and get straight to the point. In this video, I'm going to show you an alternate view on how to evaluate how good a champion truly is. Now, in this particular video, I am going to take a look at Na in the competitive scene, but that does not mean that the methodology used has to be specifically for the competitive scene or for specifically Na. It works for any role, any champion, any skill brand. So like I said, I was going to analyze Na. I was analyzing Na. And the first thing you have to do for this particular methodology is to choose a data set. What games are you going to take a look at in order to form your opinion? I decided for the summer LPL playoff games. As simple as that, it's one of the best regions in the world. I could have included the LCK as well, but that would just give me a lot more games to watch. And quite frankly, to prove a point, I don't think that's particularly worth it. In the end, these were all the games that I needed to analyze. You can see that his is at about 50% win rate, but win rate doesn't really tell you the story about how good or bad the champion is, because there's a lot of things that is not related to the win rate that affects the win rate without being to the fault of the champion. These are namely called biases. A very common thing in data analysis, you have to take biases into account. A very simple demonstration of this would be take a look at any champion being played by an Iron 4 person. You're not going to be able to make a good judgment on whether the champion is good or bad by seeing an Iron 4 player play it. That's just an example of one of the many biases, namely skill in this particular case. All of these biases do ultimately affect how good the champion appears to be in the games you watch. But all of these are not due to the champion itself, they are from things surrounding the champion, and that's why you have to take all of them into account and adjust the result based on these biases. Now, some biases are less important because they do not change things by a lot, like the minion RNG bias I just removed. It doesn't actually impact how good a champion appears to be particularly much. So all of these games I put up in a spreadsheet like this, and I jolted it down a lot of numbers, and it might look very complicated, so let's go through it step by step and see in reality what does all of this mean. First up is the matchup bias. This is simply between -2 and +2, and it simply tells us how will Na look as a champion depending on the particular matchup. A negative value here represents that it will make Na look worse than what Na actually is, aka he is countered, either soft countered or hard countered, and a positive value means Na will look better than what he actually is because he is countering the enemy. A 0 is just, it's a skill matchup. Of course, these are all just my views on the particular matchups, so in case you do not agree about the Na Fiora matchup, Na Kennen, Na Renekton, or any of the numbers you see here, you can make a local copy of the spreadsheet, you will find the link in the description, and change the values yourself and see how that affects the score. The next bias on the chopping block is the skill difference bias. This is simply, if there's a big skill discrepancy between the two players, of course that is going to affect how good Na is going to look, or whatever champion you're analyzing, but I'm going to keep referring to it as Na. This one can also go between -2 and +2, like a lot of these. The reason I've chose this particular limit between -2 and +2 is because you need both negative and positive values, because things can have a positive or negative effect. And the reason it specifically is +-2 is because that gives me a range of 5 total values, and because the score can be between 1 and 5, that gives me 5 values as well, so it just lines up very nicely. Of course, you can change the interval itself, it can be -10 to +10, it could be -5 to +5, but if you're going to do that, you're going to need to change the formulas later in order to get accurate data out of everything. Now, this is simply the skill difference between the players, like I said. I think we can all realize that if we were to pit an Iron 4 mid laner versus Caps, regardless of what champion the Iron 4 player is playing, it's going to look really bad because the skill difference is so big. Also, the matchup doesn't really matter in that. So next up is the champion proficiency bias. This one is quite simple. Of course, a champion is going to look worse than what it actually is if the person doesn't know how to play the champion. I think we can all realize that a first-time Akali player or a first-time Aurelion Sol player are not going to be able to fully utilize the strength of the champion. But because this can only be a detriment to how good the champion appears to be, this can only go between -2 and 0. If you are super proficient at a champion, you're going to show how good the champion truly is. You're not going to make the champion appear stronger than what it actually is. The next bias is the opposing of proficiency. Just like how it is important for you to be proficient on your champion, it is important for the enemy to be proficient on their champions. If they don't know how to play their champion, they're not going to know how to play the matchup, and they're not going to know how to lose gracefully, and they're going to make Gnar look better than what he actually is. And that's why this can go between 0 and +2, and no negative values. There is no way for a bad opponent to make Gnar look worse. Now you do see some question marks here. And that's because Shanji, for example, has not played more than 10 competitive games of Renekton, so I don't feel like I can evaluate how good Shanji is on Renekton when he hasn't even played 10 games on the champion. I think that would just be unfair because that's such a small sample size, so that's why I just put a question mark. Luckily, that does not put an effect on the formulas later on, unlike a 0 there would've. The next bias is simply the build bias. If you build poorly, you're going to look really weak. An extreme example of this would be you building full armor versus a full magic damage dealing team. Of course, you're not going to be able to tank them particularly well, and that's not the fault of the champion, that's your fault. And once again, that's why this can only be a negative, this can only be a detriment. It can go from -2 to 0. It can never be positive because it will never make Gnar look stronger than what he actually is. It will just show, hey, when built correctly and played correctly, this is how good Gnar is. Now you do see a question mark here, and that is not because of the amount of games, because this is from that game specifically, but that particular game was over so quickly that Gnar did not really get the time to build anything after his mythic. So I can't judge the build if he only has one item. Next up is the allied team composition bias. Now for Gnar here, because there's a lot of zeros, that might be a bit confusing about what this means. So instead, let's take a look at a different champion that might make things more obvious. If we were to analyze Kog'Maw, for example, the allied team composition can make or break that champion. If there is no peel or protection for the Kog'Maw's team, Kog'Maw is going to have an awful time, and the team composition is going to make Kog'Maw look worse than what the champion actually is. So this particular bias is just a number to see, does the team composition of the champion, or in this case Gnar, have synergy or desynergy with the champion? Or as you can see with all the zeros, there's no inherent synergy between the Gnar and the team composition, but there is also no desynergy, so Gnar doesn't really get screwed over, but it doesn't really get any stronger. The next bias is the enemy team comp bias. Of course, this is much like the ally team comp bias. If you are a champion that has a particular strength and weakness, the enemy can either drop in such a manner that is going to enhance your ability to perform what you're good at or deny what you're good at. That's why this one can also go between -2 and +2, just like the ally team composition. And you can see in a lot of these cases, there's either 0, where it doesn't make Gnar look better or worse, but there's also a lot of negatives. There's a lot of team compositions I could see here in the playoffs where Gnar actually is going to perform worse, not due to the champion itself, but just due to the enemy team composition countering Gnar in a soft counter or hard counter manner. Or you can even see a single positive one here, because there was actually a game where the enemy made Gnar look better by being clumped up and close to walls, because that's how that team composition wanted to play. Not necessarily close to walls, but being clumped up and wanting to team fight, which is where Gnar is going to excel. Next up, there is the score here. We are no longer talking about the biases. Now, it is just an objective evaluation of the champion. Now, when I say objective, it is still quite subjective, because ultimately, what did I score and how did I score it? Well, one of the things I have not mentioned so far is that it's important to realize that when you are trying to evaluate how good a champion is, you have to look at what their strengths are. And that is ultimately what you're putting a score to. In my eyes, Gnar have 2 particular strengths: lane bullying or lane dominance, and team fighting. So I gave both of those strengths individually a score between 1 and 5, and then I took the average of those scores, and that's ultimately what you see here in the score column. Now in this case, the 1 to 5 scale does not necessarily represent any particular tiers, but the way I judged it is that 3 is just average or meh, or what you could expect for someone like that. So for example, when I evaluated the team fighting aspect of Gnar, I took a look at the team fights of all of these games, and I took a look, okay, is this what you could expect from a team fighting champion? Is this just an average team fighting? Or is this above average team fighting impact, or is it a below average team fighting impact? And that is where the score was set. Now this is the adjustment. This is the average of all the biases multiplied by negative 2.5. Now, why a negative 2.5? Well, the minus sign is in order to flip the biases around. So if we take a look, for example, at matchups where Na were countered by the enemy champion, that is going to make Na look weaker. But in order to get to how good Na actually is, then we have to bump Na's number up, because ultimately his score has been lowered partially due to the matchup. So we need to increase it. That's why I'm using the minus 2.5 in order to flip the sign of the biases. Now the 2.5 is just because the maximum or minimum you can get from the average of the biases is minus 2 or positive 2. And multiplied by 2.5, you get 5, which is ultimately the scale where I put the score, between 1 and 5. So if everything is stacked against you or everything is stacked in your favor, it can literally move you from F tier, or just 1 point or whatever you want to call it, to 5 points, or vice versa. The score adjusted is simply the score plus the adjustment added together, and this value is supposed to be a more accurate representation to how good the champion actually is. Now, what this number in the score adjusted means heavily relies on what you put in your score. So for me, because I scored things in the score column based on 3 being just the average of that strength, this score adjusted is going to have the same kind of unit. So a 3 here in score adjusted just means it's a very average team fighting impact, it's a very average impacting champion. It has a very average impact on the game. It doesn't underperform, but it doesn't overperform. It just sits there right in the middle, being a bit lukewarm. At the top you can see what the average score, adjusted score is, which is 3.13, which using this methodology would suggest that Na is just having a little bit above average impact, so his impact to the games are pretty average in the areas. So if there is a particular slot for a champion like Na, he works, but he's not going to do anything in particular. One thing I think speaks very highly of this particular methodology are the Ale games. If you take a look at the scores of all the Ale games, you can see they are really, really low. But that is to be expected. If you take a look at the biases, you can see that the skill difference is pretty low, and the Na proficiency is really low. Ale never seemed to be that good of a Na player, which means that of course the scores are going to be heavily dragged down. That's why you can see in the adjustment columns of the Ale games that he gets pretty big positive adjustments. And when we take a look at the score adjusted, we can see that even if Ale performed terribly in these 7 Na games, this adjusted score gets a pretty close average to the remainder of the Na games. And I think that speaks very highly of this particular method, how we can take poor performing Na players, analyze the games as objectively as possible, and thanks to the biases, the results we ultimately get is still very close to what we expected and what all the other games from better playing Nas are. So with all this in mind, I hope you'll enjoy this a bit different view of how to analyze the strength of a particular champion. This methodology is not exclusive to the competitive scene or to Na. You can do this on any champion and in any elo bracket really. All that changes really is the data set, or rather the games you choose to analyze. If you want to see how good Na is in the gold elo, you would have to take a look at gold elo games. Then you're going to get the results you're looking for. Simply, how good is Na in gold elo solo queue. So if you want to play with this yourself, or if you want to change a bit of the values, you will find the spreadsheet in the description, where you can not only find this particular spreadsheet, but on another page you can also find just a blank template so you can play with this yourself. And I highly suggest that you do, at least give it a try. But with that said, I just want to say thank you for watching the video, and I hope you take care of yourself. I'll see you some other time.